2 million individuals stopped scrolling on Tubi in October 2024 after something appeared there. This footage was kept secret in studio vaults for more than 40 years. It was deemed too sentimental to air by the network. Red had transformed his farewell show into a confessional. As if it were his therapist, he addressed the camera directly. He exposed personal shortcomings, career lies, and family tragedies. According to viewers, it was similar to reading a diary. Why did they ultimately choose to make it public? On July 18, 1913, Red Skelton was born in a little hut in Vincennes, Indiana, 2 months after his father had away at the age of 37 from heart failure. Although his father worked as a clown in the Hagenbeck-Wallace Circus, the happiness he offered to others never made it to his own house. Red's mother was left to raise 4 boys by herself after his death, using only hard work. They had to rely on their neighbors and goodwill in order to survive after losing their little shop. Red slept hungry, wore tattered clothes, and bore the burden of being the least fortunate student in the school. However, he discovered early on that a good laugh might make anything more palatable. He used comedy as a survival tactic rather than to impress. His face, voice, timing, and truth were all shaped by that yearning, which remained with him. Red sold newspapers for 3 cents on street corners when he was 7 years old. To increase his sales, he told jokes. Sometimes they begged, sometimes they sung, and occasionally they swept. By the age of 10, he was already balancing multiple jobs, going long distances to bring home a few money, delivering ice, carrying cigars, and doing laundry. He witnessed mothers using their wedding rings as collateral for bread. He witnessed children attending school without shoes. His own education was dispersed, crammed in between jobs and failures. However, he recalled every moment he spent laughing with strangers. He was well known in the community for his ability to make a man with a broken back giggle like a child, not for his grades. He fled with a medical show when he was 10 years old. He spent his summers selling bottles of phony cure-alls for $10 a week alongside Doc Ari Lewis. At the age of 8, he slept in wagons and barns, yet he gave his mother every penny. He broke a case of glass one evening after slipping off the stage. The audience chuckled. At that moment, Red understood that mistakes might be magical if you let them to be. During his 4 years with the medical show, he learned stunts, gags, accents, pantomime, juggling, and other skills that would follow him about for the rest of his life. He learned to laugh without cause, to accomplish without praise, and to be impoverished without resentment. His father was never introduced to him. There were only tales left. Grease paint and fatigue were used to depict a man. A man whose life took more than it gave and who felt too young. Red, however, held on to those tales as if they were sacred. He looked for a father he had never touched in every dressing room mirror and circus tent he passed. That pain persisted even after the laughter had stopped and the nights had grown chilly. He once claimed that his humor was merely a means of re-establishing what was lacking at home. Everything he did was influenced by that wound. He left school at the age of 15. He had a vague promise from a Chicago burlesque comic and $135 in his pocket. He carried a suitcase, a dream, and the recollection of his mother's silent nod with him when he hitched out of Vincennes. He was never stopped by her. She realized that some children flee in the direction of something because they have previously experienced what it's like to be abandoned. Red accepted any job he could. Working during the Great Depression like a man on a clock, he toiled in backrooms, sidewalks, nightclubs, and circuses. His father used to walk the Hagenbeck-Wallace Circus, which he was touring with at the age of 16. He wasn't limited to the big top. He inhaled it. The hush before a punchline was delivered, the sawdust, the perspiration, and the anxiety. Red got more than humorous at that point. He became real at that point. He became a drummer with the Merry Mutes, a mute vaudeville act. Red was prohibited from speaking on stage at the age of 16. Rather, he squinted, danced, slipped, fell, and mimed. He imitated animals. He imitated actors. He imitated suffering. He received $5 per week. What he discovered, however, was more valuable. He learned the power of a look, a stumble, and stillness. His visage turned into a map of all the things he was unable to express as a child. Without saying a word, he was able to evoke strong emotions in others. He and Bud Jones began adding lyrics to their act in 1931. Red made people roar with his imitation of Clark Gable. During the Great Depression, their weekly income of $75 was unprecedented. However, Bud's cheating caused the act to collapse. Red was crushed. He lost his rhythm in addition to his job. He performed at walkathons, dance marathons, and other events. Both on and off stage, it was heartbreaking. However, he met Edna Stillwell, a theater usher who was better at writing a punchline than most men on radio, in the aftermath of that breakup. 1934 saw their marriage. She was 13. He was 21. Edna, however, had a pen for humor and a mind for business. They collaborated on the sketch Guzzler's Gin, which tells the story of a drinker who hides his alcohol from his wife. The crowds were enthralled. Clubs in Chicago began to call. The gateway was that sketch. No one had ever pushed Red as hard as Edna did. She authored content, arranged gigs, and more. By 1937, they were making $2,000 a week. His rubber-faced falls and Edna's flaming sets filled the Chicago Civic Opera House. However, their marriage began to deteriorate behind the scenes. The more Red rose, the more pressure caused their relationship to break. Red took a chance in 1937 by appearing on a radio program called The Avalon Time. He created Clem Cattlehopper, a slow-talking country bumpkin. Everything changed because of that one character. He was adored by audiences. Ratings increased by 30%. By 1938, Cadeel Hopper merchandise was available for purchase. His lines were imitated by children. Parents joined in the laughter. America needed what he had created. Comedy without being cruel. Innocence devoid of foolishness. A character that simultaneously made you feel stupid and comfortable. Red gets his own show on NBC in 1941. The Red Skelton Show had a weekly audience of 20 million listeners. Even though each show lasted only 15 minutes, he packed each one with of characters, voices, and routines. Junior, Willie Lump Lump, the mean little kid. One sketch after another. People were unable to get enough. But there was a cost to all that prosperity. Red never stopped working. He wrote, performed, rewrote, and fretted until he passed out one evening in 1943 while doing a live broadcast. Doctors said it was weariness, but he believed he heard his father urge, "Keep going." He couldn't breathe, couldn't stand. He was pulled off stage and the show stopped. Red described it as the worst experience of his life. However, his comedy was deeper and darker when he returned. His voice suddenly had a quality that it didn't have before. He turned the cruel little kid into one of his most well-known acts. A brat with a slapstick edge and a caustic tongue. Not everyone laughed, but audiences howled. The FCC began issuing cautions. Parents complained that it was too crude and violent. Red didn't care, though. Comedy, in his opinion, ought to depict reality, no matter how dirty or uncomfortable it may be. The controversy merely made him more well-known. The sketches were quoted by children. No one turned off the radio, but adults complained in whispers. Red was making $10,000 a week by 1944. It was money from a movie celebrity. That was money for a mansion. However, Red had a flaw. He took a chance. He lost $50,000 at one sitting one night in Las Vegas. All he had was that. Lost. Hollowed, he sat at the table. There are no more jokes. Friends made an effort to assist. Red continued to pursue the same joy he got from humor, risk, chance, and timing despite Edna's attempts to explain. He dug out of the hole for years. Even though his reputation was still growing, his financial account served as a reminder to all comedians that if you don't know when to quit, praise won't cover your expenses. The ascent of Red Skelton at MGM began in silence in 1940 but quickly gained momentum. He was signed without hesitation after a studio talent scout saw him perform his Hallmark performances on the radio. He didn't get much attention for his debut film performance in Flight Command. However, everything changed when he appeared on the day of Dr. Kildare's wedding in 1941. He shot a pantomime inebriated scene in just 2 days, giving the whole film a personal touch. The real star, Lou, later claimed that Red had stolen the photo. Not only did the crowds laugh, they returned again and time again. MGM saw it at once. They began casting him in everything they could, assuming that Skelton's presence would make even a shoddy story work. He had transitioned from radio to film. And after a year, he was doing more than just getting by at MGM. Among them, he was one of the most well-known figures. Red was given a full-fledged comedic role in Whistling in Brooklyn by 1943. And there was no hesitation at the box office. At the time, the movie brought in $2.5 million, which is now more than $40 million. The combination of sports, mystery, and clowning seemed to have been created just for him because he portrayed a detective who also enjoyed baseball. Unbeknownst to viewers, several of the jokes made use of stop-motion effects, which were uncommon at the time. He had even enlisted the assistance of a Disney technician to help timing the moves. Skelton's physical rhythm combined with these novel visual techniques created memorable moments in the movie. Red was suddenly more than just MGM's clown. He was one of their most creative stars. However, Skelton received news while filming Bathing Beauty in 1944, a year later, that drastically altered his life. Richard, his infant son, suffered leukemia. At the studio, he kept it a secret. He was the same old Red on camera. Crew members occasionally discovered him sobbing by himself in corners off camera. He persisted in filming. Even though the film was successful, he was still grieving. In 1958, Richard died at the age of 9. It altered everything, Red said. His work became more introspective. He turned his attention to philanthropy. He started to focus more on pediatric hospitals. There was something hidden behind the eyes of the clown who made everyone laugh. Something he would always have. When The Fuller Brushman debuted in 1948, more than 15 million tickets were sold worldwide. It ought to have been the pinnacle of his movie career. Theaters had to rerun sequences to quiet the laughing because his character, a clumsy but endearing door-to-door salesman, made people laugh so much. Red, however, wasn't having a party. He was under a strict contract with MGM. They helped him get through everything, including sickness and grief. They never allowed him room to breathe, he subsequently claimed. While there was genuine laughing on film, someone was being pushed to the brink. Contracts, deadlines, and ticket sales concealed his personal suffering. He received a Golden Globe nomination for The Yellow Cab Man by 1950. There was a war going on underneath what felt like recognition. He desired to create his own content and characters. That was not what MGM wanted. They desired his obedience. He declined to play a part in 1951. He was suspended by the studio. It was carried by newspapers. Actors didn't fight studios at this period, but Red did. "I don't want to be just a clown," he stated. As an artist, he desired respect. His stance signaled a change in the way celebrities were seen. He was well known enough to cause trouble for the system. And it was successful. Television came next. The Red Skelton Show debuted to roughly 30 million spectators on September 30, 1951. Everything was there on that first night. Live music, army jokes, and mime routines. People were shocked to learn that everything was live. It was among the first programs to use a new coaxial cable system to transmit from coast to coast. He took home 2 Emmys the following year. The audience didn't care when CBS attempted to moderate him by claiming his humor was too graphic. The program started to air every week. It was more than a performance. It happened. A small figure known as Freddie the Freeloader first emerged in 1952. A homeless person with a heart, a smile, and a limp. Red warned him. Claimed that a person he encountered while out and about in Chicago served as his inspiration. Despite his lack of speech, Freddie was adored by everyone. In him they saw hope. The character was more well-known than some Hollywood stars by 1953. Freddie demonstrated that a country accustomed to sophisticated humor could be won over by a hobo with great timing. However, Red's life fell apart in 1957. The man's manager and wife, Edna, admitted to having an affair with his producer. Red broke. He missed 2 shows, broke his hand, and smashed a hotel wall. It became a scandal because of the press. Fans were taken aback. Red had always come across as the family guy. Months later, he got married again. However, the harm had already been done. His image had changed. For a while, the show faltered but didn't fall apart. Even though they knew the man behind the weekly joke was in pain, the crowd still wanted it. George Appleby, the henpecked husband, was another character that Red debuted in 1958. On certain evenings, he received up to 40 million viewers. George was a miserable person who had to deal with smog, nagging, and an unresponsive environment. Although it was all staged for laughs, the truth was there. After years of smoking, Skelton's voice started to falter, so he leaned more into pantomime. Talk less and act more. His physical humor became more acute. It was not a flaw. People started to watch because of it. He received an Emmy for writing in 1962 and transferred his program to CBS. He made fun of the world, himself, and the suburbs. The network, however, desired additional edge. Jokes about politics and divorce. Skelton fought back. He wasn't a comedic rebel. He attempted, but his goal was amusement rather than controversy. His drawings started to blur the boundaries between absurdity and gravity. That Emmy wasn't only a medal. There was a change in his tone. He had something to say, yet he was still the clown. He reached his peak in 1965. Every week, 50 million people watched. To increase viewership, John Wayne appeared. Skelton revived old routines and performed Western parodies, but the public preferred color television. At first, he resisted, believing it to be a ploy. He finally gave in. He presented a retrospective including Wayne and his most well-known skits the same year. One of his most watched episodes was Scrapbook. Even though new comedians with louder voices were emerging behind him, he was once again in the lead. CBS made the decision to move on in 1969. The network sought to capitalize on teenage culture, even though Skelton's show was still performing well. They substituted edgy variety shows for him. For one last season, Red relocated to NBC. His final program ran on May 19, 1971. He quietly said goodbye at the end. The love persisted even when the laughter subsided. The final broadcast wasn't merely a show's farewell. An era came to an end. The IRS called in 1973, 2 years later. He had back taxes of $1.2 million. Poor management and poor investments. He was forced to sell his Palm Springs estate at the age of 60. In order to pay off the debt, he resumed touring and performed live in casinos. He performed for audiences that recalled the good old days. The work remained, but the glamour was gone. His struggle for survival made news. He was grinding behind the fake smile. Then he made a resurgence in 1976. He received several specials from NBC under the Funny Faces banner. He brought back Clem Cadillhopper, revised the sketches. They helped him get back on his feet by selling well in syndication and earning $500,000. The previous routines still worked. The crowd continued to chuckle. It was still with Clem. In the same year that his second wife, Georgia, passed away, Red began painting. He made over 500 oil portraits, most of them of his characters. In 1980, he staged an exhibit in Las Vegas. He sold 200 paintings for $5,000 each. The gallery was full. It wasn't just about the money. Painting was how he mourned, how he stayed alive. In his artwork, viewers saw the identical heart that they had seen on their screens. However, things faltered once more in 1981. While headlining at the Riviera Hotel in Las Vegas, Red collapsed backstage after a show. He had reverted into drinking. Nearly died that night. Friends were afraid. The stage was wearing him out, even though it had once been his medicine. But he returned again. He couldn't perform, not because he had to. He shot the Freddie the Freeloader's Christmas Dinner for HBO later that year. It featured Vincent Price and Imogene Coca and aired on December 13, 1981. The story was basic. All Freddie wanted to do was eat with a friend. The special only cost $200,000 to make, but 5 million people watched. Like him, it was quiet, kind, and heartfelt. He performed more comedic faces with Marcel Marot, the legendary French mime artist, in 1982. They engaged in a 30-minute silent gag duel. Richard's grave had been demolished by vandals just prior to the filming. Red was in pain, but she didn't express it. He didn't miss a beat on stage. He mimed, smiled, and helped the audience forget. That's what he'd always done. Then followed Funny Faces 3 in 1983. That year, Skelton revealed something few people knew. In June 1944, he had enlisted and performed for soldiers in Europe for 18 months. He performed on military radio, brought humor to bomb shelters, and gave performances during blackouts. Nobody was aware of it. He had kept it a secret, but now that it was out, people had a different perspective on the clown. He was not merely humorous. He had served in silence. He celebrated his 70th birthday that same year by performing for Queen Elizabeth II at London's Royal Albert Hall on July 18. In memory of his late father, he drew, narrated, and even played the drums. HBO produced the film, which debuted in 1984. Even though it cost the customary $200,000, the hall was packed with laughing that evening. Like the rest of us, royalty laughed. He spent over $200,000 on each of his farewell specials, which attracted about 5 million viewers. They were broadcast on HBO after being taped in Toronto. Big Heart, Simple Productions. The two most notable events were a Royal Command performance and Freddie the Freeloader's Christmas Supper. Laughter was the foundation of Red Skelton's life, yet beneath his painted smile and red nose was a guy who understood loss better than most people could ever imagine. The press hardly covered his divorce from Edna Marie Stilwell in 1957. She was more than just his spouse. She had served as his compass, manager, and writer. Valentina, their 10-year-old daughter, became the focus of an uncontrollable storm. Red was accused by Edna of being aloof. Edna, according to Red, turned their daughter against him. Edna was chosen by the court. In the open court, Red sobbed. On some days, he tried to remind everyone that he was still a father by appearing in clown makeup. Though it wasn't, it was dismissed as a publicity stunt. He knew no other way to communicate above the cacophony. Richard, his 9-year-old son, received a leukemia diagnosis a few months later in May 1958. The doctors could do nothing. As Richard's condition deteriorated, Red and his spouse, Georgia, maintained vigil at UCLA Medical Center. The youngster passed away on May 10, a few days before his 10th birthday. Red was the star of his show. On TV, Johnny Carson replaced him. Red ceased talking off camera. By 1961, he was completely consumed by grief. He attempted suicide by using sleeping medications. The part of him that danced freely never truly returned, even though doctors were able to bring him back. From that point on, he transformed all of his grief into meaning. In an effort to provide for the children he had lost, he constructed the Red Skelton Classic Learning Center in 1963. He wed Lothian Toland in 1963. Throughout the decade, they were followed by whispers of treason. The marriage ended in 1971. Once more, Red was left alone. When Georgia Davis arrived in 1973, things briefly improved. However, she died of cancer in 1976. He made no announcement. He didn't make any public appearances. Red hardly left his home for nearly 3 years. Just gloom and silence, with no stage, no spotlight, and no punchline. Red's car crashed into another car in Palm Desert on January 17, 1986. His body fractured in 12 places at the age of 73. His face was swollen and bruised, his legs were broken, and his ribs were cracked. He spent weeks in the hospital. Then came surgeries. Although he joked with the media, he was secretly worried that it might end. For months, he was unable to walk. He was unable to work. He quietly withdrew from public life, not out of resentment but out of withdrawal. Doctors informed him that his lungs were deteriorating by 1990. Long-term obstructive lung disease. Too many decades, too many cigarettes. He immediately resigned. He claimed that it was the most difficult thing he had ever done. He was an obsessive painter in his last years. Over 50,000 pieces. He let the art speak where he was unable to, sold them, and donated the proceeds to children's hospitals. Red Skelton passed away on September 17, 1997. However, he wasn't done yet. At the 38th Primetime Emmys in 1986, Lucille Ball presented Red with the Governor's Award in front of a throng in Pasadena. No one had forgotten him even though his show had been discontinued 16 years prior. Ball State University awarded him an honorary degree the same year. A Screen Actors Guild Award was given out in 1987. His name reappeared in the discourse. A generation that had grown up with him returned in droves. They recalled the face, the voice, and the melancholy concealed behind the grin. Interest was increasing once more by 1989. The Red Skelton show's 3 missing episodes were discovered. 16 more were included in a VHS compilation titled The Lost Episodes in 1990. They came from old station vaults, private collectors, and locations that had been abandoned for decades. Not all of these were reruns. People believed those moments were lost forever. Red's rituals had come back to life after being mute and blurry. In Indiana, more than 200 hours of unaired kinescopes were discovered in 2013. The clips weren't what you would have expected. These were routines about racism and civil rights that were never broadcast. They were censored sketches in the 1950s. When networks refused to store them, Skelton had authored them and battled for them. They returned decades later, presenting the world with a Red that pushed and questioned rather than merely mined or juggled. The Edna and Red Skelton collection now includes these reels. They were human, political, and unvarnished. And his art would not go away. Freddie the Freeloader paintings were fetching up to $1 million by 2020. His TV role had evolved into a work of great art. By the end of his life, Skelton was reported to have made more money from painting than from television, having begun painting in the 1960s. More than 1,000 pieces were given to museums by the Skelton estate. At the Red Skelton Museum, a $4 million gallery was constructed. What was in his study was now on display. In some way, the man who painted to cope with his sadness had painted himself into history. Another revelation was made by the Paley Center for Media in 2024. An assortment of bloopers and outtakes from his last television show in 1971. On August 1st of that year, it concluded a 20-year tenure on CBS. However, this hidden video revealed a more personal side. Red was taken off guard in the midst of emotion by the crew's laughs, missing lines, and behind-the-scenes giggles with Carol Burnett. He never imagined such material would be shown. It turned into the focal point of future retrospectives. The most eerie release of all followed. Tubi streamed the uncensored version of Red Skelton, The Farewell Specials, in October 2024. In its first week, almost 2 million people watched it. These were snippets from his season in 1981 and 1982. The majority of it had never been broadcast. Deleted content from Skelton's own cassettes was exposed in one scene, which was a 45-minute reenactment of Freddie the Freeloader's Christmas dinner. It was more than just acting. Red was in tears. Where writing had stopped, monologues continued. He addressed the camera as though it were a confessional. He spoke of his father, Joe Skelton, who passed away inside a circus tent in 1912, just 1 month before Red was born. He discussed Richard Jr.'s death in 1984. He claimed that he never recovered from that setback. Some viewers were forced to stop. It seemed too intimate, like listening to someone's diary read aloud. Skelton made an unexpected admission in the middle of the special. In 1929, he had been with the Hagenbeck-Wallace Circus for 4 months at the age of 16. He admitted to stealing physical gags, clown routines, pie-in-the-face plans, and scripts. Line by line, he committed them to memory. His shows were in Tubi's top 10, and young people, many of whom had never heard of him, learned what he could do with silence and a painted smile. He laughed through tears and said, "If I hadn't pinched those scripts, I'd still be selling soap on the streets." The footage was restored in 4K, with subtle facial twitches and tiny hand movements in his pantomimes preserved. The restoration team worked for more than a year, cleaning every frame and stabilizing every shot, turning what had been dusty and dim into something clean, sharp, and unforgettable.